Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast, and we are going to handle Genesis 11 this time. Just finished 10 last time, and we owe it to you, the listener, to put these pieces together of how Genesis 10 and Genesis 11 set up the story, really, of the entire Bible. And so, in fact, Mike, welcome back. What I'd like to do is let's talk about that word gospel for a moment, because we often think of and boy, this is really modern or current discussion among evangelical scholarship. And that is, of course, what's the definition of the gospel? And we all kind of grew up, we think, when we compare our backgrounds, of what would be called a truncated gospel. That if we, and this is easy to do as you're a child and you're listening to the sermon, that you think it's all about going to heaven when you die, right? And that the sermon can end with the appeal. It doesn't matter what denomination you're from. This is kind of cutting across all Christian lines, and it feeds into the Billy Graham model, shall we say, that the sermon will end with an appeal to get right with God, lest you go to hell. And I'm not saying that's wrong at all, because again, C.S. Lewis would say, if you can win a game, you can lose a game. And so there must be some way to lose the Christian story or be on the losing end. And so that's serious business. But when we talk about the word gospel today, the reason I want to bring it up now is because by the time we get to the end of chapter 11 today, I want the listener to say to him or herself, okay, I see where the big story of the gospel is ready to go or going forward. And so let's talk about it quick. The usual case of figuring out the gospel that I grew up with, if I can just play this off what you're remembering, Michael, and then I'll let you respond, is that we start with a problem. Or I'm sorry, we start with a solution. We know that Jesus came to solve something. Usually we end up going, because the Bible does, the text of the Gospels go to his death very quickly. You know, half of the Gospels are driving toward that last week of Jesus' life, as though the death of Jesus is something vitally important to not only the ministry of Jesus, but also why he came to earth. And so usually we come out of the death of Jesus thinking, why did he have to die? And we come up thus with the solution to a problem. And then, again, this is in my background, we think, well, what could the problem be? And we settle on Genesis 3, usually, so that the gospel then becomes the classic Romans 3, 6, 5, and 10. You know, you're a sinner, you're going to hell, Jesus died, now believe. So notice, though, that we start with a problem, going to hell, and then we go and find this. We go and find the solution based on that story. So, what N.T. Wright has done in his ministry, that it's been powerful, and I so much appreciate what he has brought to the table. But people like him, what they have challenged the evangelical world with is, guys, let's not let the gospel get so short-sighted as to think that it's just about going to heaven when we die. And he used this one illustration that he was quoted in the footnote of a paper, and it's been heralded ever since, as though he screamed this from the housetops. He says, we don't want to helicopter our way from Genesis 3 to Matthew 26 with what he called suspiciously clean feet, where you find, Adam sinned and Jesus dies, and there's your gospel. And you just basically said Genesis 4 through Matthew 25 doesn't even count, or at least it doesn't matter, Boy, those are refreshing words. To me, the beauty of a divine counsel worldview is that it's going to take into account Genesis 4 through Matthew 25. It's going to actually, if it's going to be a real worldview that works, it's going to take into account the huge story, the swath of biblical material that is coming between the fall of Adam and the death of Jesus. So I know I threw a lot at you there, Mike. What thoughts may you have there?
I think, the word you used earlier was truncated. And I think that's, when I look back at it, I think that's a very accurate word. And a lot of times I think our gospel presentations, even as we get into adulthood within the church, because of how they were presented to us as children, and maybe for that age range, doing a very short, truncated version, a very simple summary or description of the gospel and, who Jesus is. And, we're hoping and encouraging our children to make a decision to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
But that seems to be in some sense like we're kind of stuck in church at times, that we've never grown past of like, hey, let's look at, as you also put it, the rest of the story from Genesis 4 onwards and not just helicopter our way through. I think one of the benefits of having learned and grown up some of this material with Mike, and especially these last couple of years, was just this beautiful kind of recentering that it's about loyalty, it's about allegiance. And we would say this in church, but then we immediately start getting into the weeds of like, well, how do you do works? How do you have good works and then faith? But then always there's that tension, as though faith and the things you do in your physical body are in competition to your mental belief.
Right. And
I think one of the great things that Dr. Heiser had done was to kind of show faith is embodied. Mm-hmm. It's in our bodies. We live our lives through our bodies, and what we do in our actual day-to-day lives, the decisions we make, really indicate, well, what am I ultimately loyal to?
Right.
And
I was just talking. Oops, I'm sorry.
I just think that was such a very liberating thing to kind of realize. So it's not every action, but it's the overall trajectory of where my life is going. Can someone from the outside look at my life and just see in the words I say, the things I do, the things that I declare a love for and that I obviously enjoy, is it indicating some sense of loyalty towards one God or another?
And the beauty, again, of what Mike did and what we want to continue to do is to not make this a denominational issue, even a creedal issue or a confessional, but to bring a divine counsel worldview into all those confessions and say, guys, this works for everyone, right? I was just talking to a Reform friend, and I was mentioning how faith and faithfulness are the same word in Greek and Hebrew, and he brought up, well, depravity, human depravity. A person can't be faithful because they're depraved, and I noticed, and again, we're having fun because we just disagree, but how often in a study of the Bible we pit ideas against each other that are based on creedal or confessional outcomes, right? I'm Reformed, therefore I have to argue down a certain path. And my point to him in that story was to be, the liberating privilege of letting the text run your worldview is that you can look at a creed and say, well, okay, I'm going to have to back off on that rather strong statement that they came up with in the 16th century, let's say, and rethink this. And so when it comes to this point of, as you brought up, faithfulness, that's key. And as we get into the story of, here we go, let's do it now, Genesis 11. Is it possible? Let's test drive this idea even through our time this morning, that the story of Genesis 11 and then getting into 12 is the story of faithfulness, and specifically faithfulness to which deity? Okay, so that's where I'm going, and that's thus the gospel. All right, 11:1. We ended last time by saying 10:32. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to the genealogies and their nations. From these, the nations, the goyim, spread abroad on the earth after the flood. That is the way of saying, guys, we have a situation here where people are speaking different languages, tribal jealousies, anger, kings going out to war every spring. This is where this comes from. It's not a natural, when you think about this is not how evolution should work. If you're a atheistic evolutionist, if you're simply a biological evolutionist, there is no reason for humans to develop different languages, because it would make all the sense in the world for the propagation of the species and the protection of the clans and the protection of the species, frankly, to keep the same language. So that the Bible is arguing for a situation that would not have happened normally. And that's why 11:1, again, let's read it. Now the whole earth had one language. 11:1 is taking us back in time to The days just after the flood. Let's do it in verse 2. Starting in verse 2. And as people migrated from the east, now they journeyed, literally in Hebrew, they, third person plural. It doesn't tell us who the people are journeying, but I'd recommend, based on, keep going, they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar. Now, Shinar, if you're watching your Bible, the last time that word was mentioned is back in 10, I'm looking at my Bible, 10:10 is Shinar. The second time it's used is in 11:2. So does the Bible want us to connect those two? I'd say yes. So what happened in 10:10 is now the subject of 11:2. Who is the guy involved in this is, of course, Nimrod. The beginning of his kingdom was, I'm looking at 10:10, Babel. Okay, so Babylon will be mentioned first time in 10:10, second time in 11:9, when we get the story of Babel summarized. The next time the word Babel is mentioned in the Hebrew text is 2 Kings 17:24. And that's when Babylon invades. So that's the word Babylon. There's no difference in, I mean, you might as well put the word Babylon in 10:10 and 11:2 because it's the same exact word. Or I'm sorry, 11:9.
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
that I've always wondered about? Like, I know that the word in Hebrew is Babel, Babylon, but why is it, do you think, that in our English translations, instead of putting Babylon, they put Babel?
My theory is two things. One, they want to be close because if you're a editor of a Bible version, you know you're going to get hammered if you don't stick with what what word is there. Secondly, though, and I've learned this just from listening to general editors of the Bible, of Bible versions, that there's a bit of a inertia, tradition ball rolling down the hill where you don't want to upset the reader and give them a word that they're just not ready for, right? Like the Lord is my shepherd. If you put Yahweh as my shepherd in there, that's a screen door in a submarine, right? You're asking for trouble from your readership because they're just not ready to see the word Yahweh in Psalm 23:1, but it's there, right? So my guess would be you could have just as well put 10:10. The beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, but because that would stun the reader, I just think they go with Babel. That's my personal opinion because here's the point. It's this, if you look it up in Hebrew, it's the same exact word. And this comes into the difference between Jude in our Bibles. The second to last book of our Bibles is named Jude. Well, guess what word that is in Greek? Judas. It's the same word for the guy that betrayed Jesus. The problem is, if we had the second to last book in our Bible with the title Judas, does that confuse people? Oh my goodness. So
Yes.
my guess would be this is common knowledge. We renamed Judas to Jude so that people wouldn't be offended by by the title of the book. But Jesus did have a brother by the name of Judas. And that's the whole point. The Judas in the story of Jesus is his best friend, according to how the story plays out, who betrays him. And he had a brother by the same name. So I don't know. I'm getting afield, but you're bringing up a good point. Why doesn't the Bible? Oh, you know what? Do this. Hey, everyone who's, again, if you have a Bible in front of you, go to Joshua. I just found this when I was studying for this podcast. Go to Joshua 7, verse 20. Achan was he was the guy found by Joshua to not follow through on destroying, right, the Canaanites in front of him in Jericho.
Yes.
And so Achan was found out by Lot, right? And then verse 20, 7:20, Achan answered Joshua and said, "Indeed, I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I have done. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful," now what word do you have there? I have Babylonian. It's the word Shinar in Hebrew. It's exactly what's in 11:2 of Genesis. Genesis 11:2 has the word Shinar, and the same word is repeated there in 21. I wonder, this makes me wonder, the reason he grabbed that garment was because it had some kind of omen, divine, again, we're talking about a land, Shinar, the place where God divided the earth into worshiping patterns, shall we say? And could it be that what he was grabbing that garment for was its origin, its potential use as a non-Yahwistic omen, shall we say? And
oh dear.
Because the reason, of course, that stuns us is that Joshua kills him and his family,
Yeah.
and we've always wondered why. And maybe it's a worship issue. So,
I've read that passage so many times. I knew about the story of Achan, but yeah, just sometimes those little details you just don't notice.
yeah. Well, anyway, back to 11:2. I hope I answered your question, or at least gave it an opinion. So, why doesn't the Bible just give us the word? I think we're always up against translational issues, but anyway. 11:2, it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they, and I take it to be now the family of Ham back in 10:10, it's this guy, Nimrod and his people, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. This is the story of how chapter 10 came to be. And they said to one another, come, I'm in Genesis 11:3, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. This, and I think, again, the reason this is being brought up is because if you're an Israelite reading this in Judah or Israel, you have stones everywhere. Limestone, again, is everywhere in Israel. But if you go over to Babylon, you don't have that limestone everywhere. You have nothing with which to build a large building. So he's just kind of admitting, the writer and editor are saying, by the way, this is how they did it. They baked mud, and it was a technological marvel, frankly, but they figured out how to do it. Okay, verse 4, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower. The city comes first, and the tower is part of the city. I think that's key. With its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. So here is the famous story, not just of the Tower of Babel, but the city of Babylon. That's really what this is about. And by the way, if you look up to verse, again, as I said, 9, look ahead to 11:9. Therefore, its name, and its there is the city, not the tower, its name is called, and in Hebrew it reads Babylon. Now, Babel or Babylon, that's just how we always name it. Because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there, key moment, Yahweh scattered them abroad over the face of the earth, which is, again, as we saw last time, the moment of Deuteronomy 32:8. So if you're into marking your Bibles, people, I would circle 11:9 and write in your margin Deuteronomy 32:8. This is the time frame in which this event happened. So I think the text is being very, very clear about that. Back to the story of the tower itself. There are numerous towers or ziggurats, really is the modern term we use for this, that in the land of Mesopotamia, Shinar specifically, the Chaldees, which we're going to come upon, it was common that the city itself was not used for living. You would live out in the fields, but the city was used for agricultural or administrative purposes, and maybe taxation, where you'd bring in your grain, like a granary that would be in the city. Think of a city in a small sense that you could encircle with a wall, and you could run into it in times of war. But you didn't live in that city. That's not where you lived, okay? And the other thing, though, that was at the center of the city in the ancient world was a temple. Now, I hope this makes sense to everyone, that, okay, here we go, kind of a thing. This is the story of a divine council worldview come to play in our minds, that the reason you'd go into a city then is not just to pay your taxes, but to worship your deity. And they would have built him a temple, which is just usually in Hebrew the word for house. And you would put in that temple then an idol of the deity that you worship, the patron deity of that city. And then in these stories like this, and we have numerous examples of this in the ancient world, of a ziggurat. This is not the temple, but it's part of the temple complex, that it's a four-sided, it looks almost like a pyramid, but has a certain purpose to it, and that is a stairway. And so the ziggurat that we've unearthed in the modern one, we unearthed it from the sands of time. In the 1800s, I've seen time-lapse pictures between what they found under sand or when they first started digging. And now where you can go visit this thing, it's a beautifully preserved ziggurat or stair-stepping pyramid that, what's the purpose of it? Well, the temple's on the ground floor. That's where the god would come down the stairway and live. But then if you wanted to go up and talk to the god, you'd walk up the stairs, and it's like 7 stories high. And then notice how verse 4 goes. Let us build a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. It doesn't mean it circles up into the clouds. It means the top is from where we talk to and invite and supplicate and pray to and make offerings to the deity. The tower is, or the top is in the heavens, meaning that's where we commune with our deity. After that issue comes the name issue. So let's talk about that. But yeah, you were going to say?
I was going to say that I remember Mike talking about this before, Dr. Heiser, and he used the terminology of the cosmic mountain, and of this idea that how temples and even the way like the Garden of Eden is later described, and that's going to be way later if we ever get to like the book of Ezekiel, that Eden is described as though it's also on top of a mountain. That it's a lush garden, but it's also a garden temple that's on top of a mountain. And mountains were seen as these holy places because they essentially were earth, but they ascended so high that they were touching the heavens as though it was a meeting place, like an in-between place of earth and heaven.
Right.
And so thus what we're seeing with like a ziggurat is that it's like a man-made version of a mountain.
Yeah, they didn't have mountains in Mesopotamia, so you had to make your mountain. Good point.
Yeah, and so it's just interesting. It's like that it's alluding to that they self-made a man-made mountain to essentially try to have a connection between the earth and the heavens, and that the top is the meeting place.
Good. And what often happens, I know I grew up with this as my, child story, that the problem is in the land or the line, let us make a name for ourselves. That there's the problem, right? And I just think we got to be careful there because, David makes a name for himself. When he comes into the city of David or Jebus and conquers it, he doesn't call it Yahweh's city. He calls it David's city. I've always been bemused by this, that the man after God's own heart, when he conquers his capital city, he forgot to name it after his God. He named it after himself. So the point being that to name a city after yourself probably is not evil. It's maybe a little short-sighted, but the idea that, making a name is not the issue as much as, and here I'm turning in my Bible to Daniel 4, verse 30, where Nebuchadnezzar, right, he does kind of the same thing. He is the ultimate king of Babylon in the biblical story. Daniel 4, verse 30, the king spoke, saying, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling for my mighty power and the honor of my majesty? May I recommend that what God does, well, we know what God does. He, turns him into an animal. Yeah. That is not because he wanted notoriety. It's because of Daniel 4:34. Where he comes to his senses. Here's the opposite, or his moment of repentance. Now you find out what his problem was by noticing what his repentance was. He says, I lifted my eyes to the heaven and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed thee, here you go, the Most High Deity. He turns from not just worshiping himself, I think, he worships Marduk, now he worships Yahweh. In other words, the story is a supernatural issue. It's a vertical question of which deity did this guy worship and thus have a great name. So I think when we go back to 11, the question isn't, is God not wanting people to make a name for themselves? Obviously, that's not good. But is that what causes this? I'd say no. The story clearly seems to be, based on where we're going to go with it, that God is upset with the purpose of the ziggurat is to worship a deity. And I would say, based on 10:10, the deity they're worshiping, the line of Ham, Canaan, is not Yahweh. So that's the key to the story. They're going up there to worship a deity who is not Yahweh. And let's keep reading. But, verse 5, this is put in very, anthropomorphic, physical video sense, right? 10:5. The Lord came down to see. Not that God can't see everything, but that's the picture. And maybe there's a physical being involved here. We're not sure, but we'll talk about that agency idea of how Yahweh has agents who do things, and they're called angels sometimes, but let's hold off on that for now. Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower, because again, that's the same temple complex, which the children of man, notice that sons of man in 11:5, what that's kind of hinting at again. You have in the Bible two societies. You have a sons of man society. That's the horizontal physical world that we're used to. Mm-hmm. Then you get the sons of God society. That's the vertical. That's the up in the heavens society. And so you have these two worlds that are always existing. We don't know how they exist in relationship all the time. We know as a divine council worldview that we would think of them as constantly reacting to each other and people worshiping these deities and so forth, and back and forth we go. But that'll be part of our story. But when you see, and this is again my opinion, when you see that phrase "sons of men," the author's trying to drive you to think, there's the horizontal world. There must have been a divine world in play. That's all I'm saying. That it kind of emphasizes the human side in order to emphasize the divine side. By the way, this is the first occurrence of the phrase "sons of men" in the Bible.
And can I mention some, just a test drive, another idea that I always had about
Since we're
this.
test driving, let's do it. Yeah.
It's so like if, for example, like we're not told if the tower is built for Yahweh or if it's built for another divine being, right?
Right.
But what I do remember, and it's a very interesting idea, was learning about the purpose of like these ziggurats, especially the top of these towers, was that this was how the priests of that religion would try to invoke and essentially manipulate the god or goddess to come down and to basically force them down. Like, I'm going to interact with you. I want to meet you here. It's like, I'm calling you down. And what it's so interesting is that they're building this tower. They're going through all this energy and time. And verse 5 just simply says the Lord came down.
The wrong deity
city
that they weren't expecting came down. I think it's very possible that that's what the story is meant to say.
But what's funny to me is that he doesn't come down to the top of the tower.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he came down to the city to look at the tower that the children of men or the sons of men had built. And there's a bit of irony, humor, but also a little sadness whenever I have read this line.
And I've not read it that way. Thank you. This is interesting how you see that. Yeah. The Lord came down.
There's a sadness to me of you're right. The intention of the ziggurats is like, we're going to manipulate the God. We're going to bring this God down. We're going to try to interact with him. And yet on his own, out of his own free will and volition, the Lord came down.
If you're teaching this to children, boy, I'm just thinking, Mike, as you talk like this to me would be the way to. Many people have asked this on the Divine Council conversations, over the years that you've seen, and I've seen it too. How can we make this work for kids? And here's a good example, maybe, where we could say, kids, this is, and I think kids can handle this. This is exactly what a child in Israel would have understood. This tower was for the worship of other deities. And surprise, surprise, guess who showed up? Guess who came down that stairway that they had made for some other deity? Was the high God himself, the one that created that deity and told them not to worship. In other words, you could really build into a story like this, a child's version of the Divine Council worldview, and do it with kids, I think, enraptured by watching this on a video. In other words, or creating a mental image of somehow God coming down that stairway of that ziggurat saying, I know you made this for another God. Here's the problem. He is my creation. Don't worship him. Worship me. So I'm glad you saw that in 11:5.
Like in my mind, right? Like if this was a video, the Lord would not even be like stepping down on this tower. He would just appear right on the ground.
You wouldn't slide down it either. He'd just actually appear.
He would slide down. But it's just that there's the build in that sense of irony of he's here, and we could have called him anytime,
Right.
He can show up anytime, and he did on his own, and we didn't need to go through this tower building process.
Yeah. And so thank you. And so the Shem line, let's review now. The Shem line of 1022 to 32 is not the ones doing this. The ones doing this, they journeyed from the east of 11:2, is the Ham line of chapter 10, verses 6 through 20. That's why, again, what we did last time in 10:15, Canaan, the son of Ham, he is the guy who is going to beget all the nations that war against Israel. So the connection between 10 and 11 is, I think, quite clear and needs to be placed into the story of Babel and the tower itself. So, all right, ready for verse 6. So the Lord said, behold, they are one people. They have all one language, right? That's thinking back in the story of how this whole thing began. And this only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. Now, that's a fascinating idea. And I'm going to grab a book here. It's called Don't Know Much About the Universe, written by Kenneth C. Davis. He's written several don't know much abouts, like don't know much about the Civil War and things like that. So he's as I'm looking at the back cover, Kenneth C. Davis. He lives in New York, wife, 2 children, contributing editor to USA Weekend, He's a secular writer. Okay, so my point is that Kenneth Davis in this book called Don't Know Much About the Universe is not trying to give you a biblical storyline. However, what is interesting to me, and I'm sure to you, Mike, is how often when you read a secular historian, they talk in terms where you, the Bible guy, go, wait a second, that sounds just like the Bible. So here we go. I'm going to read from page 20 in his book, I Don't Know Much About the Universe. He's going through very early, page 20. We're only up to the earliest people, and he's giving a history. And remember what we just said, verse 6. Indeed, the people are one. Nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them. Okay. This is Davis now. What is clear from history, however, is that there was a burst of extraordinary development around the globe at approximately 3000 BC. For instance, at this time in ancient Mesopotamia, people developed agriculture, writing, the potter's wheel, and sailing ships. They also invented beer. These were the people who lived on the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates. The word Mesopotamia is from the Greek word between the rivers. By 2000 BC, this fertile land between the rivers is what now modern Iraq was home to a sophisticated civilization that had begun to look to the heavens for guidance. Ancient Sumerian writings attributed their knowledge to, quote, gifts of the gods, and some people have interpreted that to mean alien visitation. You might choose to accept that theory or place it on the pseudoscience spectrum somewhere alongside astral traveling and past life regressions. But what cannot be avoided is the fact that this persistent fascination or obsession with alien encounters from ages past speaks of something of the human mind, an intense desire to know what we really cannot see. And that was especially true when it came to the heavens. All right, now that's from a secular historian saying that around 2000 BC, there seems to have been this explosion of human knowledge, and it eventuated, and he gets into this later. This is why we have pyramids, not just in Giza, but we have them in Japan, off the coast, underwater. We have them in, Mexico. The idea of a pyramid or a ziggurat then, going, stair-stepping your way up to the heavens. This occurs worldwide at this time. And as you just read from Davis, this is where we get knowledge that was far beyond what had happened to that point in world history. The knowledge explosion, it's called. So again, when I read this in secular work, that tells me something that when I read 11:6, I sense that there's something going on with knowledge, that these beings are giving these people what they want. They're going up that stairway, pleading with, as you say, supplicating these gods. And these gods are, because they have a covenant with them, they are reciprocating with knowledge and astrology and agriculture and wisdom in cosmology and cosmetics and medicine and arithmetic and all this kind of stuff. So when we talk about 11:6 as though there must have been some kind of knowledge that was becoming widespread, all we got to do is look to the secular historian and they'll say, yep, that's the time. So 2000 BC, by the way, when we get to this in verse 11, chapter 11, verse 11:16, Eber begets Peleg. Remember back in 1025, Peleg is the guy that the earth divided. In other words, you can stick chapter 11 into the life of Peleg, time-wise. His date, if you are going by strict dating, that I've recommended before, is 2357. So let's say that Peleg lived in 2357. That was his birth date, BC, 2357 BC. Well, that's exactly what Davis just said. So my theory, my recommendation is that the Bible is being very spot on. It's just telling us this is what happened. There was a divine knowledge boom in this period, and it happened because this non-Yahwistic group built a temple complex that included a tower that was successful. That's the key here. It was successful in bringing down knowledge from the heavens, and that's why verse 11 or chapter 11, verse 7 has God saying, "We're going to stop this." So, any thoughts there, Mike?
Well, I also I'm thinking of it as well from the angle as well that human beings, we as the children of man, we're also made in the image of God, and there's something very interesting about the way that Yahweh says that whatever they put their minds to, whatever they propose,
yeah, good point.
It will not be impossible. It will now be impossible for them. There's nothing that will restrict us. And so there seems to be almost wow, I did create humanity with this potential and really to rule and to represent me. But when it's used in a way that is detrimental to the rule of God or the rule of Yahweh, there's dire ramifications.
Could it be the knowledge of good and evil that we got in 3:22 that is now coming out in 11:6? That comprehensive knowledge? To me, good and evil is that way of saying bookends from A to Z. That there's something that these people now know that they shouldn't know, and the 3:22 is coming to fruition in 11:6. That would be maybe another connection to make here.
Interesting, yeah.
But and it's all based on the knowledge or the image of divine beings in man, that we think thoughts after them. And so it's not hard for us to come down from that ziggurat saying, hey, I've got an idea. And it might look like I just made it up in my mind, but I got it from a deity. And that's to find the root of pi and blah, blah, blah. I mean, who knows how this works? I'm not a mathematician, but that's the story that you read from the secular historian, that a lot of arithmetic understanding, mathematical understanding came during that knowledge explosion of 2000 BC. Well, let's keep going. 11:7. Let us. There's that magical third person or second. What is that? First person plural. Let us go down. We had it in 126. Let us make man in our image. We had it in 322. How does it go? 322 has the actual verse I'm looking for now. The Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. Our third example of us in the Bible is now, come, let us go down. The fourth and last will be Isaiah 6, who will go for us. So the question, again, my Bible has a capitalized you there on us. I would recommend taking that off just to let the Bible reader make that judgment for himself. Are we talking about God talking amongst himself in the Trinitarian sense, or are we talking about Yahweh speaking with his court, his host, his council? All those words are the same. Or at least are synonymous in the text. So I think, and I'm sure you'd agree, Mike, that he's talking to his courtroom throne room, assistants. He's talking to, like any king, the greater the king, the greater the court, that he's talking to this vast host of beings that often go and do messages to the earth. They're called angels, in the Bible. But here's an example of him talking to them. So it's not capitalized. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
And let us go down, and they're confused their language. Notice it doesn't say, and I had this vision in my head as a kid, that one morning Jacob woke up and he spoke a different language. And he comes around the corner with a load of bricks, and his friend Frank is speaking Ugaritic, and I'm speaking Sumerian, and all of a sudden we drop our bricks and head different directions. What you could do, and I think this is where, again, study Bibles help, is the way God did this is not said. So now go ahead and offer ideas, or test drive some ideas. One of the best that I've heard is that the way that languages often happened was that, and a friend of mine showed me a book, and it was just providential over breakfast. Again, he was reading a book, and I talked about this, and he said, hey, this guy has this idea that what happened was an invading army comes into town, disperses the city, conquers it, and as those people go out, and here's where the idea of language, how does language develop? Well, and this is from the book he was reading, that language often develops differences from whether it be dialects to actual languages. They occur because, again, without the internet, you don't have a way to compare how you sound to different parts of the world. And that if you are working with water versus hills and trees and so forth, that different languages have different abilities to develop, because vowels and consonants or fricatives have different ways of carrying over water, for example. A consonant carries over water better than a vowel sound. And so, English is very driven by vowel, I think, sounds based probably because of French and that kind of stuff. Hebrew, if you've ever heard a Hebrew speaking person, it's very punctiliar. It's very guttural. It's very back of the throat, kind of in your face. And so, in other words, the development of languages, all I'm getting at is the development of languages may have been a natural occurrence because of people being spread out because of invasion. That's possible. I'm just saying that the text isn't getting into that. And so the idea of him coming around the corner and his brother speaks a different language may be a different, or maybe an unnecessary, miraculous intervention, which you don't even need that. So let us go down there and confuse their language, we don't know how it happens. Let's go on to verse 8. So the Lord scattered them. And there's your Deuteronomy 32, verse 8 idea. This is when Deuteronomy 32:8 happened. He scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. Okay, now, we haven't ended we need to end the story just for time, but let's finish it. Verse 9, therefore its name is called Babylon, same word, because there Yahweh confused the languages of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. So there's the story. It's the way Deuteronomy 32 happened in video format. In theological understanding, Yahweh was separating them out by gods, and these nations will worship different deities, all by God's design. And here's where I want to end then by saying, do you see the problem? Could this be the problem that Jesus comes, A, to solve, and B, to commission Paul to solve? You see what I'm saying? That when Jesus appears to Paul on the road to Damascus, that's the second half of Jesus' ministry, because it was Jesus that met him. And he said, I have a job for you that I never got to, and that is I want you to go to Spain. I want you to get as far west as you can to, I'm giving away my story here, Mike, so feel free to jump in when I'm done. But the purpose of Jesus coming, dying and resurrecting, I know there's a lot to get through there, but then commissioning, he wasn't done. He commissioned Saul, now Paul, to pursue this story all the way to the end of the earth. Why? Because I would recommend, here's my test drive that I'm going to be playing out. I'm the guy with the microphone, so I guess I have to be the one to do this. That what you have in 11, Genesis 10 and 11, and really you can go back to Genesis 1 through 11 and say it this way. The problem is not sin, and the solution isn't forgiveness. The problem is worship, and the solution is worldwide worship. In other words, the problem will be a worship of different deities that has been spread upon the earth How are we going to solve this? Yahweh doesn't want us to worship these beings. How do we solve a world that speaks different languages, worships different gods? We need, well, ... And could it be that everything now from, and we haven't read it, and I'm not going to read it, but chapter 11, starting in verse 10, going through verse 26. If you have a Bible open, it's just 10, verses 10 through 26. That's all 10 generations of Noah all the way down to Abraham. So it gives the genealogy in years, right? So if this is a tight, if this is a tight genealogy, you're going from after the flood would be 2458. This is my own, using a calculator. 1110, Arphaxad 2 years after the flood, 2458. Then you can just do your math all the way down to verse, it would be 27 or 26. Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, that's 2166. Now we can nail down Abraham's birth. This is the first datable event in the Bible, if we want to be really careful, through secular sources. And we can do this in 1 Kings 6 and such, that you can get to what's the earliest datable event in the Bible by secular sources or sourcing. It would be the birth of Abraham, 2166. No one really doubts that. You can look that up with any, with assurance in almost any secular or Jewish or Christian academic work. The earliest datable event in the Bible. There it is. How do you go backwards then? You just add up the numbers. And that's how you get Peleg, by the way, in verse 16 through 18, living through the time of the Tower of Babel. Now, my point being then is you get to 27. This is the genealogy of Terah. And then you have a story, I'd recommend, that starts the solution to what we just described. The problem is we have a world full of people worshiping the wrong deity. Now, may we go back to this issue of sin and forgiveness and all that. Do you see how that becomes a subset issue? When the elevator door is closing and I want to give the gospel to someone and I've only got 5 seconds, what do I shout into the elevator? Traditionally, we'd say, repent of your sin, or ask God to forgive you, or accept the payment of the atonement. Well, that would be what
justification by faith.
Justification by faith alone. May I recommend that what we'd yell into that elevator is join the right family, worship the right deity, something like that. In other words, it would be a worship answer, not a sin management answer. And because the reason I would recommend that is, as I've test driven that idea through the rest of the Bible, now you don't suspiciously wake up with clean feet after getting off a helicopter in Matthew 26. What you do is you trudge through Genesis 12, 13, 14, Leviticus, 2 Kings, the Psalms, the proverb. In other words, every page, and this will be fun to do someday, Mike, maybe even on a podcast. We'll do this just as a whim. We're just going to open our Bible anywhere, close your eyes, put your finger down. I bet you within 1 or an inch and a half, 1 or 1.5 inches from where your finger lands, you're going to have a story, a verse, a phrase that somehow tells the story of which God you should be worshiping. And it's not going to be about sin and forgiveness. It's going to be about worshiping the right deity. And it all starts because of Genesis 1 through 11. So I made my case and we got to shut it down. But what do you think?
I think it's a fair case. And, I think especially as we head towards 11, like the way I've always head towards 12, 12 is the answer to what the setup from 1 to 11 was about. Yeah. There's a reason why, a lot of modern scholarship says that Genesis 1 to 11 is pretty much setting up the problem. Yeah. And once we get into 12, you start seeing God's or Yahweh's implementation of a solution.
Right.
And it's a fascinating solution. And actually, this does bring up to something I had mentioned at the last episode about a little bit of mentioning Gentry and Dr. McDowell. there was something very interesting in Gentry's paper. He was talking about the words Selim and Demut, image and likeness.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he concluded towards the end of his paper was that, isn't it interesting that likeness, Demut, which in his research seems to indicate the horizontal rulership of a king, that is applied to humanity, not to the divine beings. And in his conjecture, he wonders, and he's kind of like sort of suggesting that he believes this, that humanity alone is given the rulership, not just vertical representation with Yahweh, but horizontal rulership of physical creation, not the divine beings. And when he mentioned that, that made me wonder, so what is going on with the whole entire division of the nations then? That in some sense, like, it was never the intention, or never really the original intention, the ideal intention was for these sons of Elohim, the sons of God, to basically have any sort of interaction with the physical world, even especially with people.
Right.
And because that can just cause haywire chaos. And so I'm still running through that in the back of my mind as we're reading through this, of like, oh boy, like this is like this is like where you're mixing baking soda and vinegar, and if you know anything about those two combinations, you know the inevitability. If those two interact, there is a reaction.
Yeah,
and it's like how long can we hold this off?
Yeah,
and anyways, it's just a fascinating idea, and I do wonder. Now here is the solution God is essentially going to start proposing in chapter 12 that we get into next. Of, all right, if the ultimate problem is who are you loyal to, who are you worshiping, let's start simply with one family.
And we're not throwing out behavior and forgiveness. I'm just saying that that's a subset. In other words, behavior is bad because you worship the wrong deity. I think that's what the argument of Paul will be in Romans 1. If you go down the path of rejecting Yahweh, look out. It's going to end up, remember how Romans 1 ends, with doing all sorts of bad stuff, but it all starts because they gave up, and they gave up worship. So,
or even just in some sense, they've turned our eyes away from the one that they were created in the image of, and so some sense there's a bit of a malfunctioning of what we were designed to be.
Yeah. When I hear Matthew 5-7, when Jesus is talking about what God wants us to be like, right? Pray for your enemy. I think if there was a Joseph there, even a Moses and Abraham, at the very beginning of this story, they worshiped Yahweh. I think a Joseph would have listened to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and said, yeah, that sounds just like the God I know. Not that I've not screwed up in life and made messes of things, but when it comes to how Yahweh wants me to act, it took a Jesus in Matthew 5 to straighten out centuries of misunderstanding that are going to take place between, Genesis 4 and Matthew 25. So that huge gap or that huge amount of Bible that we have to work through, it takes time. And as you said at the beginning of your comment, that God's starting the solution in Genesis 12. In the back of my mind, I said, boy, he takes his time. Boy, God takes his time. I mean, my goodness, we got to get through a lot of this stuff just to get to Matthew 26. But that's the beauty of it. We're going to get off that. Not that helicopter. We're going to trudge through the story, and our feet are going to get really dirty. And we're going to watch David commit adultery and murder. And yet we're going to hear, and this is your sermon that you're going to be preaching, you're going to hear him talk to God in ways that just evince worship. He may be mad at God. He may be mad at people. He may be sad. He may be happy. But the whole story is going to rotate around a man, David, who knew God's heart. So.
And I think there is something to be said about there's a beauty when you see a person who really fully, I am pouring all myself into this choice that I'm going to be loyal to this person or whoever that you're giving your allegiance to. There is something very inspirational and very beautiful about that.
Yeah.
And the very opposite in my mind at times would be when you're forcing it upon someone with no choice. Like you said in the previous episode of how in the world did they choose their gods? Did they even have a choice to choose their gods?
Yeah.
And it was simply, oh, my father worshipped this deity. Yeah. So it's in some sense, it's just family tradition. I will just follow along. And it was not really a conscious, like, I really want to devote myself to this Elohim, to this God.
And let's end it here then and start next time by reading Joshua 24:2, which says, Abraham worshipped other gods. That's the story. We're going to have a beginning of Genesis 12, not of Abraham listening to a Christian radio station every morning and, having devotions and all that. We have a guy who's a pagan. He's an from the very beginning of his life, he is a pagan man, and he's worshiping probably Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, and he is going to convert to the worship of Yahweh. So we'll hang on to that for next time. Thank you, Mike. It's always a joy to talk to you and to do this study, as we're doing it here. I hope folks are enjoying it as much as I am, because I really look forward to these times that I can talk to you about the text. So, until next time, thank you.